It starts with a simple fact. Laws first restricted the sale and transfer of certain items, which already caused confusion, debate, and legal challenges. But now reports indicate the focus is shifting. Possession itself, something many believed untouchable, is being scrutinized. Suddenly, what you thought was securely yours may no longer be so straightforward under the law. This raises a critical question. Are these actions a legitimate enforcement of existing statutes, or are authorities stretching the law beyond its original intent? I want you to think about that and share your thoughts in the comments below. To understand what's happening, we need to go back to the foundation of the law in question. According to official records, restrictions on sales and transfers were first enacted to address public safety concerns. The laws were designed to regulate who could acquire these items and under what circumstances. They were widely reported in government press releases and legal analyses, emphasizing compliance for prospective buyers and sellers. But legal experts quickly noted a gray area. The statutes addressed the movement of these items from one person to another, but they did not explicitly clarify what happens to individuals who already legally possessed them before the law came into effect. This gap created uncertainty. Tenants, homeowners, and collectors alike began asking questions. Does this apply to me? Am I now in violation just for owning something I lawfully acquired? The first notable incident occurred shortly after the law took effect. According to verified reports, enforcement agencies began issuing warnings and notices to owners, highlighting potential violations for possession without a sale or transfer. The department stated that compliance checks were routine, but the impact was immediate. Legal experts noted that owners were suddenly facing risks they had never anticipated. Here's where the story gets complex. Laws regulating possession often intersect with constitutional protections, particularly regarding property rights. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that no one shall be deprived of property without due process of law. Courts would likely examine whether enforcing possession restrictions without proper notice or clear legislative authority could constitute an overreach. One interpretation is that the law simply clarifies the extent of regulatory authority enforcing restrictions consistently and uniformly. Another perspective raised in legal commentary is that targeting possession without explicit statutory language may challenge the principle that individuals have a reasonable expectation of legal ownership. Historical context is essential to understand why this matters. Similar patterns have occurred in the past, where sales restrictions were enacted first, followed by debates over possession. In each instance, the courts were tasked with balancing public safety concerns against individual property rights. Precedent shows that courts often scrutinize whether legislative intent justifies encroaching on existing lawful ownership. The narrative of this current situation unfolds chronologically. First, the sale and transfer restrictions were implemented, creating an immediate compliance challenge for businesses and individuals alike. Then, enforcement agencies began clarifying, through notices, guidance documents, and warnings, that possession could also fall under scrutiny. Public reaction was swift, with legal analysts, advocacy groups, and the media raising questions about the scope and fairness of these measures. From a legal standpoint, this is a pivotal moment. Courts will likely examine the statutes carefully, considering whether enforcement aligns with legislative intent and constitutional protections. One consideration is whether the law was drafted narrowly enough to avoid infringing on existing lawful ownership, or whether additional interpretation is required to ensure fairness. Another critical point is the federal versus state dynamic. While state law may impose certain possession restrictions, federal regulations can either reinforce or limit those provisions. This creates a complex legal landscape where compliance requires careful attention to both state statutes and federal guidance. Practical consequences for lawful owners are significant. Without clear legal understanding, individuals risk enforcement actions, penalties, or even confiscation, despite believing they acted within their rights. This is why legal clarity, public awareness, and professional guidance are essential. From an analytical perspective, the situation also highlights the importance of precedent. Courts may reference prior cases involving similar restrictions, weighing factors such as intent, notice, and proportionality. These interpretations could shape the long-term implications for ownership and regulatory enforcement nationwide. In my legal analysis, the key takeaway is this. The law may not have changed possession rights outright, but the enforcement and interpretation are evolving. What was once considered secure ownership may now be subject to scrutiny, emphasizing the need for informed, responsible action. As we continue, let's examine the first real-world cases that triggered widespread attention. According to verified reports, certain enforcement agencies began sending notices to individuals who lawfully possessed regulated items. These notices highlighted potential violations under the new framework, even when the items were acquired before the sales ban took effect. The department stated that these measures were intended to ensure compliance and public safety, but for many owners, it felt like an entirely new layer of risk. One notable incident involved a longtime collector who had legally acquired several items over the years. According to court filings, the individual received a warning suggesting that mere possession could now fall under regulatory scrutiny. The plaintiff alleges that prior ownership should have exempted them, citing both state statute language and constitutional protections. This case became a focal point for legal debate because it challenged the assumption that possession, once lawful, is automatically secure. Chronologically, this is how the enforcement narrative unfolded. First, the law restricted sales and transfers. Businesses complied, adjusting policies and inventory practices. Then, enforcement agencies expanded oversight, sending notices to existing owners. Finally, disputes reached courts, prompting a detailed legal analysis of possession rights versus regulatory authority. Legally, several constitutional and statutory issues are now at play. The Fifth Amendment, guaranteeing due process, ensures that individuals cannot lose property without proper legal procedure. Courts would likely examine whether targeting possession without explicit statutory clarity could violate this fundamental protection. One interpretation is that enforcement merely extends the scope of an already lawful regulation to maintain consistency. Another perspective raised in court filings is that such action risks overreach, potentially infringing on the rights of owners who complied fully with prior laws. In my legal analysis, this is a gray area where judicial interpretation will be pivotal. Federal precedent also comes into play. Previous cases regarding regulated items have consistently emphasized that laws must be applied fairly and clearly. Courts have ruled that retroactive enforcement or ambiguous restrictions can constitute legal overreach. This is particularly relevant when existing possession is suddenly subject to new scrutiny. From a practical perspective, the implications are significant. Owners may face administrative action, fines, or even temporary seizure of property. Legal counsel now recommends careful documentation of lawful ownership, including receipts, registration records, and any prior compliance evidence. These measures can be critical if enforcement escalates. Political realities also shape enforcement. Supporters of the law argue that expanding oversight to possession is necessary to achieve the intended public safety outcomes. They emphasize that loopholes or ambiguities could undermine the original purpose of restricting sales. Critics, however, warn that overbroad enforcement risks alienating law-abiding citizens and may trigger constitutional challenges. Courts are now examining these arguments carefully. Key turning points include judicial interpretation of statutory language, analysis of legislative intent, and consideration of precedent regarding retroactive enforcement. Each ruling could set a benchmark for how possession laws are applied nationwide. Another point of debate is proportionality. Enforcement agencies are tasked with balancing public safety against individual rights. Courts often evaluate whether penalties, notices, or confiscation actions are reasonable relative to the intended regulatory goal. This legal scrutiny ensures that owners are not unfairly penalized. From a strategic standpoint, owners are advised to stay informed, maintain documentation, and engage legal counsel proactively. This is not about resisting the law. It's about understanding it, ensuring compliance, and protecting property rights responsibly. Now, consider this scenario. An owner who has fully complied with all previous regulations suddenly faces a notice that possession is now restricted. What should they do? In my legal analysis, the safest approach is to follow guidance, document all ownership records, and seek professional advice if there is any ambiguity. Courts will likely evaluate these steps when determining compliance and potential penalties. Looking at historical parallels, similar enforcement expansions have occurred in other regulatory areas, whether environmental, financial, or safety-related. In each case, the courts clarified the limits of enforcement, balancing government objectives against individual rights. This demonstrates that legal challenges are an essential part of ensuring fairness in evolving regulatory frameworks. As we reach the final layer of this story, it's essential to understand the constitutional framework that governs these enforcement actions. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In practical terms, this means that the government cannot simply target someone's possessions without clear legal authority, notice, and an opportunity to respond. Courts would likely examine whether current enforcement actions respect these procedural safeguards. The 14th Amendment also comes into play, ensuring equal protection under the law. If possession restrictions are applied inconsistently or disproportionately target certain groups, constitutional challenges could arise. Judicial precedent shows that courts take these protections seriously, especially when property that was legally acquired is suddenly under threat. Federal law intersects as well. Regulations concerning ownership and possession may be guided by federal oversight, particularly when items are already registered, licensed, or otherwise monitored at a national level. This creates a layered legal environment where state enforcement must align with both federal statutes and constitutional safeguards. Historically, similar legal expansions, where possession became regulated after sales restrictions, have been tested in court. In many instances, judges emphasize that owners who acquired items lawfully retain rights that cannot be retroactively nullified without due process. These rulings provide a blueprint for how current disputes may unfold. Real-world implications are significant. Lawful owners now need to be vigilant, maintain records, registrations, receipts, and proof of prior compliance. While enforcement agencies emphasize public safety, owners who are unaware of their rights or fail to document lawful possession risk penalties or temporary seizure. Politically, this situation is contentious. Supporters argue that extending restrictions to possession closes loopholes and strengthens regulatory goals. Critics argue that this can overreach, placing law-abiding citizens in legal jeopardy. Courts will weigh these arguments carefully, balancing regulatory objectives with constitutional protections. From a practical standpoint, the safest approach for owners is informed compliance. Ensuring that documentation is complete, consulting legal guidance, and understanding both state and federal rules are essential steps. This is not about resisting the law. It's about being informed and acting responsibly within it. Now, let's consider long-term implications. If possession restrictions become widely enforced, we could see standardized documentation requirements for existing owners, increased judicial review to ensure due process is respected, potential amendments or clarifications in the law to prevent ambiguity, broader awareness among owners about regulatory boundaries. In my legal analysis, one key lesson emerges. Awareness and preparation are your strongest protections. Laws may evolve, enforcement priorities may shift, but understanding your rights and obligations ensures that you remain compliant while protecting property that is legally yours. Before we wrap up, here's a final question for you. Do you believe that extending enforcement to existing possession is a necessary step for public safety, or does it risk undermining individual property rights? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more professional, fact-based legal analysis, make sure you subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future investigative videos. And don't forget, tell me in the comments what topic you want us to cover next. Your suggestion could be the focus of our next deep dive legal analysis. Because in the world of law, knowledge is power. Headlines may tell you what changed, but only understanding reveals why it matters. Remember, stay informed, act responsibly, and always know your rights.